Hey everyone, in this video we're going to go over a bunch of different options, different ways that you can heat your tiny house. We're going to talk about wood burning stoves, propane heat, electric heat, in-floor radiant heat, supplementing with solar air heaters, and for each one of those options we're going to talk about the pros and cons and important considerations when choosing your system. So the first thing you're going to want to do is size your system. You're going to want to calculate how many BTUs your space requires. BTUs is basically just a standardized unit of measurement for cooling and heating. So you can go online, search for BTU calculators, there's plenty of them available, and basically what you do is you fill in your information and it'll give you an approximate BTU number that you can use as reference when you're shopping around for your heating system. So the first option we're going to talk about, and probably one of the most popular, is a wood burning stove. Wood burning stoves are fantastic, especially if you're trying to be off the grid. They provide a nice dry heat which can help avoid humidity problems. They can also be relatively inexpensive to install and maintain, and they just provide that really nice atmosphere that a fireplace has. Some of the drawbacks of a fireplace or things to consider are that you kind of need to be there. You kind of need to be at home. If you're at home, keeping a fire going, if you're living in your tiny house most of the time, it's not really a problem. But if you intend to go away for extended periods, your tiny house is not going to be heated. Your water pipes might freeze, and there's all sorts of considerations there that you got to keep in mind. It can also be challenging if you're in a really cold climate. Let's say you're going to bed at night, and right before going to bed, you feed the fire, you go to sleep, but you wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, it's freezing cold, and the fire's been out for a couple hours. If you're living like this for months on end, and you're always getting up at night maintaining the fire, that can get pretty exhausting. So it's definitely something to consider. We have met some people living in tiny houses that have a fireplace, but they also have supplemental heat that is set onto a thermostat, and it kicks in when the temperature goes below a certain amount. So they'll have a propane system or an electric system. Another thing to consider with a fireplace is the size. Nowadays they make a bunch of different options, mini little stoves for boats and tiny houses that work great. We've seen some miniature ones that can still heat up a tiny house in a really cold winter, no problem. But the thing to keep in mind here is that the smaller it is, the smaller the pieces of wood that you can put in there. So you can't put in a huge log that'll burn for several hours like you would in a regular wood stove. You're gonna have to maintain it more regularly. Also, every wood stove requires a certain amount of clearance between the stove and any other surface in your tiny house for safety reasons. So even though you can find really small wood stoves, they're still going to take up a certain amount of space in your tiny house when you consider the clearance that needs to be around them. There are some bigger stove options like the Morsu stove that have their own built-in heat shield. So with this you can get a bigger stove that doesn't need to be right in the middle of your tiny house. But this stove, the Morsu for example, is quite a bit more expensive than the smaller options. The next option we're going to talk about are propane heaters. And the main benefits of propane are that you can be off-grid, and also you can get propane heating systems that can be thermostat controlled. So you set the desired temperature, it turns on and off by itself, so you can leave your tiny house and you know that a certain temperature will be maintained, your pipes aren't going to freeze, and also while you're living in it, it's really low maintenance. You can even go to bed at night. You don't have to wake up to feed a fire, and it's just kind of running itself. The drawbacks of propane are that, well, some people don't like the idea of burning gas in their tiny house. And obviously the propane costs something. You have to go and get your propane tank filled up or exchanged. And they're usually really big and pretty heavy, and that's just an extra task that you have to do. So if you are going to go with propane heat, make sure you get a direct vent unit. So those are units that exhaust fumes and vapors directly to the outside of the house. Also, definitely try to get a thermostat controlled unit, because I think that is the main benefit of propane, is that you can be off-grid and also have a unit that's thermostat controlled. Next option we're going to talk about is electric heating. Electric heating can be great if you're planning to be on the grid. So maybe you're parked in someone's driveway where you have access to power, or you're on a piece of land where you do have access to power. It can be a great low-cost option. You can get portable units like ceramic heaters, and there's also a few good options now for small baseboard heaters and wall-mounted heaters that are thermostat controlled. A good example is this NV panel heater. It's really flat and takes very little space when mounted on the wall, and we've seen a few people really enjoy this in their tiny house. Electric heat is just a great option if you plan to be on the grid. It's cost effective and really low maintenance. Next is in-floor radiant heat. So you can have systems that are in the floor or under the floor. And these are electric, so they're great if you're going to be plugged onto the grid. What's great about in-floor heating is that it doesn't take up any precious space in your tiny house. It's just in the floor. So you don't have a furnace, a fireplace, a radiator. It's just a great space saver. And it's apparently also one of the most comfortable ways to heat up a tiny house. We met a woman who spent several cold winters in her tiny house, and in-floor heating was her only source of heat, and she just loved it. It's probably more comfortable because you're actually heating up the floor, so the structure of your tiny house. So the actual house is getting hotter, as opposed to just blowing hot air in the tiny house, for example. So in-floor radiant heat can be a great, comfortable, space-saving alternative, but you do have to be plugged onto the grid. The last thing we're going to talk about is supplementing with a solar air heater. Basically, a solar air heater is a very simple design. It's a dark glass casing with a series of pipes on the inside. It's mounted to the outside of your tiny house facing south, and it basically captures energy from the sun and turns it into hot air inside the casing. There's a small fan hooked up to a small solar panel on the system, and it just blows that hot air into the tiny house and helps supplement the heat. What's interesting is that on the coldest winter days, it's usually really sunny outside, and that's when you're using up your heating system the most. So it's nice to have something like this that can supplement your main system. We actually met a guy who spent a whole winter in his tiny house in a really cold area of Canada, and this kind of system worked so well for him that he only spent $100 for the whole winter on his electric heating. Something really important that you're going to want to do, especially if you go with a wood burning stove, but it can also really help with any other option, is that you're going to want to build your house with really good insulation. Try to seal it as much as possible, seal the envelope as much as possible, and install a heat recovery ventilation unit. To simplify, a heat recovery ventilation unit is a system that allows fresh air to get into your house and stale air to exit the house without losing too much energy. So it basically takes the hot air from inside your house and uses that hot air to heat up the cold air coming in, the fresh cold air coming in. So with this type of system, you lose very little energy, but you still get fresh air coming into your tiny house. And if you build your tiny house like this, it's going to be so much more comfortable to live in cold climates. Your temperature fluctuations are not going to be as drastic or as quick, and it's just going to be a much more pleasant environment to live in. You're also going to burn less wood, you're going to use up less electricity or propane. It's just going to be way more economical and way more comfortable in the long run. So thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful. If you want to see more stories of people experiencing tiny house living, talking about the pros and cons, check out our playlists. There's plenty of great content there. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe. We post a new video every single week.